Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation, as I foreshadowed in the first reading of the bill, shows all the signs of being rushed, being ill-conceived and lacking proper consultation. We saw that with major changes made at the Select Committee. The authors of the bill seemed to imagine that they could order the network providers to decrypt communications carried over their networks for which they never had the keys for the decryption to take place. They had to back off that. The authors of this bill and the government seemed to think they could order companies that were not domiciled in New Zealand to follow our law as against the conflict with the laws in their country of origin. They had to admit that and back that off. They made changes in the Select Committee, but I woke up this morning to read the Dominion to find that another major change has been made at the 11th hour. This will come in the Minister's SOP, that now Clause 39 will be removed. That's the clause that allows the government to block an overseas company from offering services in New Zealand if it lacks interception capability. What is the cause of that? That change, that SOP, has been made outside of the Select Committee process. It's been made in a private deal between the Minister and some of the big companies, and we haven't been given an explanation, and we should be given an explanation as to why the government members on the Select Committee were ordered to stand behind that clause all the way through the discussions, to die in the ditch for the government stand on it, only to have the rug pulled out from under their feet and have that clause changed at the 11th hour. Mr. Speaker, does that sound to you like legislation that is properly thought through, properly worked out and introduced in the right way? You know how it was introduced, Mr. Speaker? It was tabled one day and it came in under urgency the very next day. It was rammed through the House under urgency. And then they referred it to a Select Committee, but they did not give the normal period of time on a particularly complex and controversial piece of legislation for those making submissions to put those submissions together and for the committee to properly consider it and analyse its shortcomings and its lack of safeguards. Mr. Speaker, this legislation, in a word, is a shambles, and it's shown by the Minister's act this very day in reversing a stance that her lobby fodder MPs on the committee supported all the way through to deliberation. Mr. Speaker, it's serious that any legislation be handled in this way, but it's particularly serious when you have a piece of legislation that confers major powers onto a government to intrude on the privacy of New Zealanders and to direct private companies as to how they should operate. Mr. Speaker, this bill, for example, requires companies to notify the GCSB about any procurement that they might make. And is the company expected to sit back and wait until it gets approval from the government, whose time frame might be quite unreasonable and might hold up the process of the change that the internet company needs to make? This bill allows the Minister to direct industry to take actions or to desist from taking actions without the adequacy of the safeguards put into the English legislation dealing with security, where you at least had an advisory board where somebody knew the technical details and the implications and the consequences of what the Minister was doing, because too often we've seen in this House the Minister, him or herself, won't understand those technicalities or those implications. We saw that from the Minister of Education at question time. Mr. Speaker, we needed adequate time to analyse this legislation, but the government insisted on ramming it through its first reading under urgency and curtailing the time that people had to make submissions and the committee had to consider those submissions. You know, the other big worry about this legislation is that it might simply provide the mechanisms for the intrusion on privacy, but what it does is actually implements a huge policy change made in a related piece of legislation, the Government Communications Security Bureau Act. That legislation, Mr Speaker, was changed also under urgency by the government to give this agency, for the first time in its history, the right to spy on New Zealanders. And it did so without even considering holding an independent public inquiry, which was the first thing, Mr Joyce, that the Australians did when they were introducing their legislation that gave powers to intrude on the privacy of individuals. They held an inquiry, and by God, we needed an inquiry, because this legislation comes about, and its associated bill, because of abuse of power by the GCSB. It comes about because there aren't sufficient safeguards on how the GCSB exercises its authority. In our fraternal parliaments in Australia and Canada and the United Kingdom, they don't put the minister in charge of the agency on the committee that oversees it. They keep ministers off. But we have our Prime Minister chairing the committee, setting the agenda, and very rarely calling it together. And we call that a safeguard against the abuse of powers of the GCSB. We oppose that legislation, and therefore we oppose this legislation that enables it to be implemented, Mr Speaker. I remind the House that that GCSB Act was passed on the vote by the narrowest of margins, by 2 votes from 2 members who are widely regarded by the public as being discredited, Mr Speaker. We haven't got the safeguards, and we know from what is happening internationally that this sort of legislation needs proper safeguards. We've had the revelations from the leaks by Edward Snowden, the man that showed that actually the American NSA agency was spying on hundreds of thousands of American citizens, not citizens that had any association with terrorist organisations or criminal organisations. They were even spying, actually it was the GCHQ in the United Kingdom, revealed in the same leaks, spying on friendly allied countries. We need the safeguards in this legislation, or this legislation will not do. Mr Speaker, it's a fact that almost every submission before the Select Committee on this legislation opposed it. Vodafone, Telecom, the Telecom Users Association, Internet New Zealand, Google, Facebook, Tech Liberty, the New Zealand Law Society, Microsoft and Mega. Every one of those agencies said this is ill-conceived legislation that will not do what it's meant to do. And let me make the point about this, Mr Speaker. We had the officials admit to us that the loopholes will prevent this legislation even doing what the government members claim for it. The loophole that says over-the-top providers like Skype, more and more people using Skype, are not covered by it. The loopholes that say that small telecom companies are exempt. They are massive loopholes. The professional terrorist and criminal organisations will use those loopholes. We won't be catching the crooks, but we will be locking up in the data gathering tens of thousands of innocent New Zealanders who will be being spied upon and their data being collected. Mr Speaker, in the last minute that I've got, I think it's about a minute, I just want to say this. This is the submission from Google that said that given the short time available on the bill, they weren't able to analyse it properly. But they do say this: the lack of transparency involved in the various processes under the bill will likely raise public fears of unjustified intrusion into their privacy. They say that the additional costs and time and challenges imposed on the bill will encourage local and international entities from making new service offerings available in New Zealand, and also lead to existing agencies withdrawing services. This is bad legislation, introduced under bad process, and the Labor Party is opposing it.
A point of order, Brendan Horan. Sir, I seek leave for my vote to be recorded in support of the earlier motion to refer the Telecommunications, Interception Capability and Security Bill to the Law and Order Committee. In doing so, sir, I acknowledge that the Greens support democracy by casting my proxy, and I regret that on this occasion I did not clearly communicate my intention to the Greens.
Just a clarification, the member can't actually seek to go back and rechange the vote, but he can seek to have it recorded in the journals of the House. Is that what the member is seeking?
Yes, sir.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? There is none. It will be so recorded. Ian McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Without